All right. Baruch haba, welcome. I'm very glad you all are here. Those of you who are here. Hopefully the others are just having some internet issues that will be resolved soon. Let's just start with a quick prayer. Avinu Malkeinu, todah lecha lechol asher יש פה עכשיו. אתה יודע, אדוני, את מכאוב אשר יש לכל בחיינו, אדוני. כן יהי רצון, אדוני, כי תמלא את לבבנו בתורתך ובדבריך, כי לא יהיה לנו יראות אחרות, רק אתה, אדוני. אנחנו אוהבים אותך, ואנחנו, רק יש לנו יראה לך, אדוני, יראתך. תודה לך. תיגע את פי היום הזה, אדוני, כי אני יכול לדבר רק את הרוצה. תשלח נא את רוח הקודש עלינו, אדוני. תודה לך, כי אנחנו יודעים את שמך. בכל הדברים האלה אנחנו נברך לך, בזכות ישוע המשיח. Okay, let's get rolling. Let me just check in, make sure that everybody is hearing me okay. Look at that. All right, so let's get into it. Bezrat Hashem. The Torah portion today is vayehi ba'et hahiy. And I'm not sure why it's labeled this. I would have thought it would be something more like Vayered Yehuda, right? And Judah went down, because that seems like more of a unique phraseology. But according to Dr. Mann, it's Vayehi ba'et hahiy. So okay, so we left it like that. Maybe in the future we can call it by a different name. And that means something loosely like, so it happened at that time, or it happened accordingly, something like this. Yeah? The Torah portion is just one chapter this week for our triennial cycle. It is Genesis chapter 38. And the haftarah, which is also very interesting, but I don't think we'll have time to get into today, as I'm trying to keep my teachings down to about an hour and a half. I'm really trying. Not just for you, but also because when we go through and we edit the teachings afterwards, and we break them into part 1, part 2, part 3, and then we do those live chat sessions during the week where we play them on our YouTube channel. It's much easier to break an hour and a half into 30. When it's like 2 hours, I'm like, 48 minutes and 32. And so I think overall it's just better if we have the teachings this way. I don't mind going longer, but I need to hear back from people if everybody wants them to always be long. So the haftarah is Yeshayahu, that's Isaiah, chapter 37, verses 31 through 35, and chapter 38, verses 1 through 6. Although there's some discrepancy. So if for any of the other teachers who taught on the haftarah, it's fine just to start with verse 31 and go on like 10 verses or so, 14 verses. They found different ancient readings in the Geniza at Egypt. So again, some say on the triennial, that's just the triennial that's in doubt, the triennial haftarah, right? We know it starts Isaiah 37, 31, but apparently there were some traditions where they did like I have it on the screen, which makes, I think, more sense. And then there were others where it just goes blasts all the way through to verse 6, right? All right. I went with Dr. Mann's opinion, so. Okay, so let's get started. We start in Genesis chapter 38. Verse 1, you should all be following my screen. You should see the Hebrew on the screen and my camera with the blue background. So in our studio, let's see. All right. Vayehi ba'et vayered Yehuda me'et Echav, vayehet Arish Adulami u'shemo Chira. So it happened, or it came to pass, about that time, that Yehuda went down, vayered, he went down, me'et Echav, from being with eight Echav, his brothers. And it's a little bit strange how this next phrase, how it says vayet ad, which means like he turned, or it can be turned or stretched, ad, until. So the phraseology is a bit strange. That's what the little a is saying in the Biblia Hebräica Stuttgartensia, that they think this actually should be el, like unto. So, okay. Maybe it was used in those days in that strange way. Ish adulami, to a man who was an Adulamite, right? So he's from this region, that region with that name. Ushemo, and his name was Chira. His name was Chira. Now, Qimchi comments on why it is that Yehuda went down. So some of the sages believe that this actually happened before the incident with Yosef, right? Ibn Ezra is one of them. Ibn Ezra, in the Mikot Gadlot, he says, hey, the language that's used by hahiy, it doesn't tell us that this is consecutive, right? The usual consecutive language that's used in Breshit is Achrei Hadarim, or Acher Hadarim Ha'eli, after these matters, right? And this just says it happened around that time. So Ibn Ezra makes the argument, which I disagree with, but he's Ibn Ezra. I'm just going to share it with you. Maybe I'm wrong and he's right. He makes the argument that this was before all that stuff happened. And you could kind of support his opinion because remember we have the incident when Yosef is being sold into slavery where Yehuda seems to kind of be like a little bit late on the scene, right? So maybe there's some justification to that. But many of the sages believe that no, this was indeed consecutive. And Qimchi, Rabbi Qimchi, also known as the Radaq, hold on, someone's microphone is on. Please check your mics. I hear like some clicking or something. Yeah, someone's clicking. Okay, there's two of you that have microphones. I'm going to manually mute you. But please, it interrupts the flow of things. Please be careful, guys, yeah? Okay, I muted one, and now I muted the other. Okay. All right, I won't say who you are, but if it happens again and again, I'll have to. So Rabbi Qimchi says that after Yosef was sold, Yehuda went down from his brothers. Evidently from Dotan to Adulam was a descent, right? So he's saying the way the geography worked. And Qimchi's not the only one. Radaq's not the only one. The Bechor Shor explains, he also believes he went down after the incident, right? He doesn't state that, but we can tell by his reason. Because Yehuda could not stand to see his father suffering for what they had done, right? Remember, we're told that his father's grief was endless. He said, I'll go down to the grave in grief for my son, Yosef. And so Yehuda, not being totally insensitive, he couldn't stand it anymore. I think Bechor Shor's got something. That makes a lot of sense, because why move, right? You've got everything there. Your family's there. There's protection. The name has great renown. There's the pechad-Ya'aqov, which is one of the titles of God. He's the pechad-Ya'aqov, the dread of Jacob, right? The dread of Israel. All of our neighbors in the Middle East, they have this dread today. They have the dread of Israel, the dread of Yaakov, because they realize what happens if you attack Israel. You're going to get walloped. You're going to get walloped. And so it's amazing to see this divine epithet still alive today. But nevertheless, Yehuda decided to strike out on his own. He had to separate himself. He could not stand his father's grief. If you have a comment, please feel free to chime in the chat. We keep our microphones off right now for any visitors. The microphones stay off. You can say goodbye or whatever at the end if you like. But this is a little bit different than the morning elder, Josh. The elders don't mind if you have your microphones on. I ask you to please keep them off because I prefer that if you type a message, then if I feel like I'm in the flow or something, or I feel like maybe the Ruach gave me a good idea, I don't get so interrupted. I think maybe the elders are better multitaskers than I am. So I can't stand the asynchronous interruptions. Somebody said something, I'm like, where was I? So that's why, okay? It's just my own deficiency in multitasking. Okay, so let's go on to the next verse. Verse 2. Vayasham Yehuda בת-איש כנעני ושמו שוע ויקחיה ויבוא אליה. All right, so when or then Yehuda saw there, Sham, what did he see? בת-איש, the daughter of a man. Okay, or that's actually her name. She's בת-איש. Maybe that's her nickname. Hey, בת-איש. So it's interesting how the Torah phrases this. Kena'ani. So that looks like it says a Canaanite, right? On the surface, that says a Canaanite. But as I've been sharing with you guys a lot, those of you who have been paying attention recently, I've been showing you how oftentimes the Hebrew is so amazing. When we look in the Hebrew, Sometimes you catch an amazing gem, something that's lost in translation, or sometimes the translators are biased for their own denominational worldview, right? And they inject that into the story. But then there's other times where we just see the way that people talked, right? Like you remember I pointed out how Rivka, for example, she says halazeh, right? Instead of hazeh, right? There's some dialectical oddities that happen sometimes from speaker to speaker. And the Torah captures that. When Yosef HaTzadik speaks later in the narrative, he uses some Egyptian terms because he's been living in Egypt for a long time, right? It just makes sense. And so this is something that's lost when we're just reading a translation. The translators, they don't mean to not bring that over to you, right? They just, the translation becomes very wordy, right? If you want to put all this stuff in there, right? And so it has to be flattened out. And so, but when you read in the original, it's like, for me, it feels like it's another level of how accurate the biblical text is. It is so accurate that it even catches people's dialectical speech, right? It captures the odd ways they speak. Sometimes, like in the case of the servant of Abraham, he also, remember when Eliezer goes to find a wife, he also speaks kind of strangely. Even though he's been in Abraham's house, it seems like he's still got some other kind of dialect that he uses. And these things start to bubble up to the surface. Not only the way that people speak, but the way they spoke at that time. So when we read in the later Hebrew, in the later prophets, there's other speech patterns. There's even other endings to words that happen sometimes. And so to me, it's really amazing. And I love seeing these things when you're reading. And it's, you know what, since we started the triennial cycle, it's easier for me to notice these things. Because usually when we do the annual cycle, it's so fast, right? You go through the whole Torah 1 year. Now that we're taking 3.5 years, we've slowed down gears to do the ancient Israeli triennial reading. I start to notice more things like this because, you can read through the Torah portion more times, right? Or just go slower on it, right? So it's really, really something interesting. I really like it. And I hope you guys are starting to see and enjoy those things as well, yeah? Okay. So in this case, here it is. So it looks like it says Canaanite, right? But let me read you, I copy-pasted a section from my book here where I comment on this. So I'll just quote myself. It says in the book, Genesis Look Again, Targum Onqelos clarifies in Aramaic that she was a Bath Gevar Tigorah. Okay, she was a daughter of a trader, right? That is like a merchant, right? So Onkelos, when he translates into Aramaic in the Second Temple period, he understands this to mean that it was already understood in our tradition and also at the time. So he brought it into Aramaic so that those Jews who didn't understand Hebrew, who were just reading Aramaic, they would see, okay, she's a trader, right? And not mistakenly think that she's actually a Canaanite. Targum Yonatan, that's another Aramaic translation, agrees with this translation. It's also worth noting that the Bible refers to someone by the region in which they currently live. You understand? Let me give you an example. There's sometimes confusion. Sometimes people ask me questions like, what about this person? Why is he doing this? Right? And one of those questions I had one time was about Shemuel, right? Shemuel. Why was the Shemuel hanavi, Samuel the prophet, why was he allowed to serve in the Mishkan, right? Because we're told in the text that his father, Elqanah, was married to his first wife, Hannah, he was an Ephrathi, an Ephraimite, right? So if you just read that on the surface text without understanding the way that people spoke, it's not enough to just get the language. We have to understand the cultural milieu, right? The way that people at certain times use things, the way the jargon worked. And so what happens is that the Bible calls somebody by where they're from. We still see this happening in Israel today. In Israel, 20% of Israelis are from Russia, right? And or I should say they're Russian speakers. So they might have been born in Israel, but parents from Russia, something like that. And those who actually are from Russia, if someone will refer to them as a Russian, which is funny because in Russia, those who grew up during the Soviet times, on their national documents, the cards were kind of racist. So it would only say Russian if you were an ethnic Russian, right? It wouldn't say you're a Russian citizen, but you don't get Russian on your national ID card. Well, they call it internal passport. Instead, it would say Jew, Yivrei, well, really Hebrew. It's a Hebrew, right? And so these guys, I had a friend who was from Ukraine who lived, I met in Ilya Bonevich. I met when I was at school in Boston. And he used to complain about this all the time. He said, oh, over there, we are never called Jew. We're never called Russian. Now we come here, everybody say I'm Russian. So it's like, you're a Jewish guy, right? So it's like, what's going on? Over there, I wanted to be Russian and I can't be, and now I'm over here and I don't want to be, and now I am. Right? And it's the same way in Israel. They call the guys from Russia, they call them Russians because that's where they're from. It's not about ethnicity. And this is actually a continued tradition from biblical times till the present day, right? So I was even called a Filipino before. It's kind of funny. So I'm a Filipino when I'm in Israel. But when I'm here in the Philippines, everybody calls me Kano, like an American. So it's like, which is not great when you're at the market and you're trying to get the best price. So it's the same thing happening here. So it might be as the Targumim render it, a trader, right? But it could also just be that somebody from Canaan, right? Right? They could have even moved from somewhere else and been there, right? So, because a lot of times people get uptight. What? How can you marry a Canaanite? You're not supposed to marry Canaanites, right? And so I'm just giving you this plausible explanation that she might have been, but she might not have been, right? There's a lot of room to consider it differently. Continuing with my commentary. For example, Shemuel, the Navi's father, that's what I was trying to tell you. He's referred to as from the hills of Ephraim, right? And he's called an Ephraimite. Well, he clearly is a Levi, right? That's why Samuel was allowed to work in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, because he was from the right tribe, right? So again, the Torah is calling his father by the place he is from, when really his tribe is Levi. You can read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. Similarly, Levites today are called Jews, right? Just like the rest of us, from Yehuda, because those who are alive today, the Levites who are alive today, were from the region of Yehuda, right? So that's how we get the term Jew, right? Jew is from Yehuda, right? I think in Arabic it's Yehud. Maybe Joshua can correct me if that's wrong, right? And so today we have even the Levites who are not really technically Jews, right? I mean, if we go by the etymology of the word, right? They're not Judean. I mean, they're not from Judah, but they are Judeans, right? The other Levites got wiped out or lost in the captivities and all that stuff. But the ones who are alive today, those are from Judea. Their ancestry is from Judea and Samaria, which is, again, crazy why people would claim that somehow the Palestinians, the so-called Palestinians, are the ones who should own that territory. We're the ones native from that territory. They moved in from Jordan and from Egypt and from other places. Just kind of silly. All right. Regarding this issue, the Gemara asks a question. So when we talk about Gemara, for those of you who are new, this is the running commentary in the Talmud, right? So it's commenting on the Mishnah, which is the oral law, right? Our tradition on how to interpret the law, as well as on the Bible itself. There's all kinds of comments about the Bible. It's very interesting. So the Gemara is written in Jewish Aramaic, and that's the running commentary on the Hebrew Mishnah, okay? Which is another proof that people sometimes think that in the days when Yeshua walked the earth, that they didn't speak Hebrew in Israel, which is just silliness. Because the Mishnah, which was written down later, which was maintained by memorization, but was an oral tradition, right? So it could have changed to Aramaic. That would have been fine. It's actually in Hebrew. It's in Hebrew, right? So it's just kind of another proof that Hebrew was at least one of the languages that was spoken in the land of Israel in the time of the Messiah. So the Gemara asks, Avraham Avinu warned Yitzchak, who warned Yaakov, who warned Yehuda regarding marrying Canaanite women, right? Canaanite women. And Yehuda went on to marry one? Question mark. You see, so I love how the Gemara will do this. It'll say, like, for example, in Sanhedrin, it says in one place that they're discussing the tradition that King David would wake up in the middle of the night, Chatzi Laila, right? He'd wake up in the middle of the night, and Ruach HaKodesh would come upon him, and he would play his harp, and he would write music, right? And the Gemara asks, so how did David know when it was midnight? I mean, the middle of the night, exactly, right? The middle of the night, not necessarily 12 like we say, but the middle of the darkness, right? And another commentator says, Moses had to inquire from God when was midnight, but David knew, right? David's not greater than Moses, right? And so the answer then comes, because there was a wind that the Spirit would send that would strum the strings on an instrument that he hung out on the balcony, and it would wake him up at Chatzi Laila, and that's how he knew what it was, right? So it's always asking these kind of questions, and so it's fun when you read the Gemara. If you're studying Gemara, I mean, sometimes it's totally dull, right? But other times it makes you laugh. Sometimes it's sarcastic, and sometimes there's an argument, right? And so anyway, so here we say, so they're showing how ridiculous it is to assume that Judah would have married an actual Canaanite, right? Is warned from his great grandfather all the way down, and really he's going to just violate it so openly. Judah. So Rabbi Shimon bar Lachish in the Gemara explains that the word here means merchant, as we see a similar word used in Yeshayahu, chapter 23, verse 9. That's Isaiah. Kin'an. You see it's very close? Kin'an. It's close to the Kinaani. Here's Kinaani, and here's Kin'an. Halot, this is the Hebrewish and Aramaic lexicon, the Alta Testament, confirms this meaning as cognate to Egyptian. So there's an Egyptian word even. This really is going to prove the point. Kin'anu in ancient Egyptian, having the same meaning. Isn't that nice? So now we have not only our tradition, not only the translation into Aramaic of Onqelos and Yonatan, or at least pseudo Yonatan rather, and we not only have the Talmud giving testimony in the Gemara, we also have a modern scholarly lexicon, which is the premier lexicon for biblical Hebrew used by Christian and Jewish scholars today in academia, right? So I'm not talking about ultra Orthodox who don't like to touch modern scholarship, but the Orthodox who use modern scholarship, they trust Halot. Halot confirms this meaning as cognate. And now the other great Hebrew dictionary is called DCH, the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew by Klein, and it even has an alternative entry for Kanaani, merchant, right? So one entry says Canaanite. It can also mean merchant, right? And here's the reference: Talmud Tractate Pesachim, page 50, first part of the page, and there's the Halot and DCH references, if you like. Genesis chapter 38, verses 3 through 7. Okay, it's kind of small on my screen. Let me look at my tab instead. All right. ותהר ותלך בין, ויקרא את שמו Er. So, hold on. Okay. Now she conceived and she gave birth to a bain, to a son. Vayikra, and she called it Shemo, his name, Er. Verse 4. Vatahar od bateled bain, vatikra et Shemo Onan. Then she became pregnant, Od, again, bateled, and she gave birth to a bain, to a son. Vatikra, and she called it Shemo, his name, Onan. Wish it was Conan. Onan. Verse 5. Vatosef od bateled bain, ותקרא את שמו שאלה, והיה בכזיב בליטה אותו. Now she continued, that's Vatosef, Od, again, Vateled, and she gave birth to a bain, a son. Vatikra, and she called et Shemo, his name, Shelah. V'haya bichziv, and he was with chaziv. So presumably the text is kind of confusing. It probably means Judah, right? Judah was with Chaziv. Yeah. Okay. Velita, when she gave birth, Oto, to him. Okay. Verse 6. Vayikach Yehuda Isha le'er bechoro ushemah Tamar. Then Yehuda took a wife for Er, Bechoro, his Bechor, his firstborn, Ushema, and her name was Tamar. Verse 7. Vayehi Er, Bechor, Yehuda, Rabbeinu Adonai, Vayimitehu Adonai. Now Er, Vayehi Er, now Er was the Bechor Yehuda, Yehuda's firstborn. He was Ra, he He was evil, be'enei Adonai, in the Lord's sight. Vayimitehu Adonai. So then Adonai killed him. Didn't get away with nothing back then, right? The reason people might wonder why this doesn't happen today, right? Why it doesn't happen today that that people get smitten by the Lord, right? That they get knocked down by God, and the reason really is because we are not as holy as our ancestors were. We don't live in such a holy time as our ancestors did, a holy place as they did, and so we don't deserve the chastisement. It's kind of strange to think of being smitten down as being something that is better to happen while you're alive than to have to deal with later. But the idea is he paid for his sin already, right? He got killed. Okay. And I have, again, some comments from my book I wanted to share with you guys. So this clause is extremely difficult to translate for several reasons. That's the chaziv guy, right? Where it said bichziv. Remember I said it's worded strangely? Okay, so some interpret this as menopause instead of the name, right? But it's also a name of a town. So it's possible to render, he, Yehuda, was at Kaziv when she gave birth, right? That's how I rendered it just now in the live translation. This makes sense, as there was a town in Yehuda referred to in later times as Kozeba. This is also how Targum Onqelos translates it into Aramaic, so he treats it like a place. Targum Yonatan, however, translates, because her husband had forgotten her and was in Paskat. This is a different name for Kaziv, meaning a failing or cessation when she birthed him. Rashi interprets it to mean she ceased birthing children after this child. The Septuagint confuses things a bit more by stating that the wife was the one in Kaziv. Right? She's over in Kaziv. Since the Hebrew hahiy, he was, renders in the Greek here as aute. So aute is aute en. So that's she was. The aute is she. Okay, so it's kind of funny. Halot translates Kaziv as amniotic membrane enclosing a fetus. So that's our modern scholarly lexicon, mentioning it was thought to bring good fortune when a child was born this way. Sforno explains, so this is the sage Sforno from the Mikhail Gedolot, he explains that the reason for naming the child Shelah, petition or plea, is because Yehuda was absent when she gave birth. Apparently, she announced also her pregnancy had come to an end. It's my belief that two or more things had happened here. Yehuda was gone, Shua had a child while in menopause, and realized this would be her last child because she's already been experiencing menopause, right? So the child's kind of pseudo-miraculous anyway. So why do I have all these things, these contrasting opinions I want to share with you? Because again, I want to make sure you guys are starting to become familiar with the idea that what the biblical text says is not always as rock solid as a translation puts it, right? When we read a translation, they pick a way to translate it. You have to, right? So I'm not picking on the translators. You have to pick a way to translate it. Pick a way to translate it, and that's how it is. The problem is it glosses over uncertainties in the text, right? And so I think it's important to know when something is mysterious in the Bible, when something is, we're not sure about it, right? And so that is yet another benefit of looking at the original languages. When we look to the original, not only do we find out more interesting tidbits, right? Like how people talked and that kind of stuff, but we also learn what we don't know, right? If you just read it in English or Spanish or Hebrew, Russian, modern Hebrew maybe, one of these things, then you don't know what we don't know. But when we read in the Hebrew and we dig and we look up the words and we look what the sages say and, oh my gosh, we're not really sure what this means. So here's the options. And when you have the options, it's better because when other scripture is interpreting this scripture and they're connected, we can have a better understanding. And this helps to deal with apparent contradictions in the Bible. Many of those so-called contradictions are issues like the one at hand here, where someone is looking at an English translation. Why does the Bible say this? Look, it says that. Look. The atheist is shoving it in your face, and you're like, well, let's look. And when you look in the Hebrew and you look to see what our tradition says, and we see how it's been interpreted by the scribes who maintain the ancient traditions, then we understand, okay, it actually makes sense. This apparent contradiction isn't what it says at all. It's actually the other meaning of the word, right? Or the other way that it's used. She's not a Canaanite. Jude is not a terrible person, not, at least not yet. It's actually just a merchant's daughter, right? It's allowed. All right, let me check in, see if there's any comments or questions. Okay, Ted on the connection says maybe it's the connection in certain areas. Mine is clear. Okay, yeah, that resolves it then. Yeah, thanks. Dr. Vera is trying to come in. Maybe there's a bad signal. Thank you for that. Okay. All right. Elder Tom comments, Rabbi, what is the nationality of Tamar? I tried to search it, but there is no information. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, it's unknown. Unknown. Right? We just understand merchant, right? And a merchant's daughter, rather. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. Perhaps she even came down from the land where Abraham came from, right? Maybe she comes out of right? We don't know. We really don't know. It's a great question, though, Tom. If anybody finds out or finds a tradition that tells us, that would be nice to know. Remember, Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, he tells us what evil is. Evil is disobeying the law of God, God's law, right? He says, I would not have known what sin is if not for the law of God, right? And a lot of people, I've said this before, but we have some visitors, and I just want to make sure people remember it, right? I've kind of broken out of the idea that I can't ever talk about the same thing again, right? Some section, because I realize people forget over time. So it's good to repeat something sometimes. So here's the rationale. When Paul, Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, when he says without the Torah is just and good and true, right? And he goes on to say that without the Torah, he would not have known what sin is. So what does he mean? Does he mean that he wouldn't know that rape is evil? Right? Because oftentimes the goyim, this is how they understand it, right? The goyim, they think that, oh, well, the law taught them that murder is sin. The law taught them that rape is sin. The law taught them that theft is sin, okay? Yeah, it does say those things, right? But there's something inside of humanity, the blueprint from God that is in us, that the very bad sins, most of the bad sins, we can figure out. Because we are made, B'Tselem Elokim, to be imagers of God, to copy God, right? That's why we exist, V'Dumato, and also in his likeness, right? And so look at Japan. I love to choose Japan as an example. If you look at Japan, I don't know what the rate is today, but I remember years back I researched this, and I found that the murder rate that year in Japan were 6 people. In the entire nation of Japan, 6 people were murdered. Right now, I used to live by Los Angeles, near to Los Angeles, and my best friend from high school, he was training to be a doctor in the Navy, and I was so excited because they sent him to live in LA for a while. They moved him there before sending him to Iraq. So before he went to Iraq, they wanted him to be working at a hospital in LA, Los Angeles. Do you know why? Because LA is one of the worst cities. LA, there's several murders a day. Right, so in Japan, the 6 that they have in a year, that's like one day in Los Angeles on a bad day. And so he got to see gunshot victims coming in, stuff he would see in Iraq, right? And so Los Angeles, I used to say when people say, "Oh, how's California?" I'm like, "Don't move to California." Los Angeles is like training for Baghdad. Okay, back then when the war was going on in Iraq. So yeah, so the Japanese, look, they don't have Torah, but they don't murder, right? People I've known, friends of mine who have visited Japan, said that they could leave their bicycle outside of a store with whatever goods they had bought, just hanging out in the basket, unlocked in the bike, hanging off the side, the little plastic bags hanging off, and nobody would steal it. Whether it was electronics or groceries, nobody's going to steal it. And nobody would take the bicycle either. So the Japanese don't steal. We can remember this. Japan, they seem to care about their country. They don't throw trash all over the place. Goodness, where I live, if you walk up the hill, there's a nice view of a mountain in the distance. And sometimes, we like to walk up there and see the distant view. But I tell you what, every time there's new trash, people are just throwing trash down. Just nobody cares. Candy wrappers, bottles. Even in Israel, in Haifa, when I lived in Haifa, some of the Russians, well, I'm assuming Russians, because you'd always find vodka bottles laying around in the park, right? And we'd pick them up and throw them away. And next day there's more. It's just like, so not in Japan. Doesn't have it in Japan. And many people are familiar when there's an emergency. It's not just me first. They're orderly. They line up nicely. So clearly, when Paul talks about, if not for the Torah, I would not have known what sin is, he's not talking about obvious sins. Plato and Aristotle, they discovered many of the obvious sins, right? The concept of treating others the way you want to be treated, The Stoics were aware of this. The Greek Stoics, later the Roman Stoics as well. So these things the philosophers of mankind have discovered. Not murdering, not stealing, not raping, not taxing exorbitant amounts, not charging enormous interest to people who borrow, not oppressing the poor, etc., etc., etc. Many societies have known these things for a long time, and they don't have Torah. So what does it mean? So the Goyim are wrong, right? Because the Goyim, what they're doing, they're trying to split the law of God. And by the way, I don't mean the 10 Commandments. I mean all of the commandments in the Torah, like how to dress, how to eat. Don't eat shrimp, don't eat pork, don't eat octopus or squid or calamari, or don't touch a dead thing, right? Don't have a picnic at the graveyard with your family, because a graveyard is an unclean place spiritually, and it will tarnish your soul just for being there, right? Like all these mistakes that they're going to make because they don't know God's word. But Paul says, I know what sin is because I have the law of God. I know what it is. And so the Japanese, what they don't know is they don't know that working on Saturday is a death penalty offense, right? This is what Paul means. How could you possibly guess that Saturday is the day where you shouldn't work, right? It's not a concept. It's the fourth commandment in the 10 commandments, all right? It comes before murder, all right? The Sabbath is before murder. And we're told that God blessed the seventh day and he made it holy. He didn't bless a day, and he never unblessed the Sabbath day. Where in the text? People say, oh, but Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday. So what? Does it say that he then cursed Sabbath and made it like all the other days, and now Sunday's the real day? It's just silliness. This is what happens when people don't read the Bible. They don't really research it, and they just believe whatever propaganda their denomination feeds them, right? God bless it. He never unblessed it. That's it. It's the only day that's holy. It's the only day, in the week, right? I don't mean holidays. It's the only day in the Hebrew Bible which has a name. Sunday through Friday. They're just called day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. Only Shabbat has a name because it's special. It's holy. Right? It's different. So, all right. Let's get back to this. So Yehuda clearly would not have just violated this norm about marrying a Canaanite. So the case with Er that Tet was asking about, he was wicked. We don't know exactly why, but because he was violating this kind of precursors to the Torah that were taught by Abraham down. Some of the sages believe he actually knew the Torah, right? That he did have the Torah, right? And so his children also would have known it, and his grandchildren would have known it, and his great-grandchildren, who we're talking about now, they would have known it, right? So I don't buy that entirely, but I think I prefer the idea that some of it was discovered. That makes some sense, right? Because we have other issues with Israelites marrying their aunties and stuff like this, which is later forbidden in the Torah, and that was very common, right? So how could you say that, right? That they had the Torah? Okay, let me check real quick. Okay, somebody asked me in private, Rabbi, what do we do if we have bad or wicked thoughts? Thank you. Okay, so this is a good question. So the question is controlling our thought life, right? The answer is not simple. There's a multi-pronged approach, right? So first of all, to the brother who asked that, be careful that when you judge yourself, you're not comparing yourself to other people, okay? The correct way to judge yourself is to compare yourself to you. How were you yesterday? How were you last week? So let's say you have these bad thoughts, whatever they are. You want to murder your boss or something, or whatever it is, okay? And you relish them. You say you have these bad thoughts. So the question is, a year ago, did you have more bad thoughts than you have now? If so, relax a little bit. You're on the right track. You're improving your walk. It is a walk. Sometimes we stumble off the side. David HaMelech, he says, Shigayot miyavin in the Psalms, errors, like mistakes. When you make a mistake and you sin, who can understand why they happen? Why they happen? These shigayot, these errors, right? And that's even like a minimal. Now, if you have a bad thought in your mind, it's not the same as acting out the thought, okay? This is more of a potential sin, right? So you haven't necessarily sinned. Some of us were tormented by thoughts, right? Like in my youth, I was kind of obsessive compulsive, right? I had really touching walls and stuff and wanting to balance it, and I'd count everything, and I'd read things backwards. I'd be on a road trip with my parents, and all the signs I read forward, reading backwards. It was don't step on the cracks on the ground, all that kind of crazy stuff, right? I was never diagnosed, but eventually I broke myself of it because I was just tired of, my friends were like, Jeremiah, what are you doing touching the wall? Let's go, right? I was irritated that I was wasting time, right? Everything's got to be perfectly organized. And, it's like, what a waste of time. What a waste of my life. And so I broke out of that stuff, right? So I used to have thoughts that pop in my mind, right? And it was very hard to stop thinking about them because sometimes, some of us, when the thought comes in, now you're focused on defeating it, right? You want to get it out. But because you're doing that, you're focusing on the thought and it won't leave. So really, this is not the right approach. The right approach, I don't believe, at least for some personality types, is not brute force. Get out of my mind, right? Get out, get out. That's not the way. The better way is relax a little bit, okay? Remember that you're a human, all right? You're a ben Adam, and then say, am I moving forward in my walk? Am I better than I was last year? Am I better than I was a couple months ago? And if the answer is yes, then rejoice. You're becoming less despicable every day. And every night when we go to sleep, it's not our righteousness that God looks at. When we confess our sins to him and we ask for forgiveness and we in turn forgive, we say the bedtime Shema, right? I've shared with you guys before, we forgive all of those who sinned against us and we ask God not to punish them, this very ancient Jewish prayer. Then we're clean. You start the next day clean. So when you wake up, you're even better than you've ever been, right? You're sinless from that moment. Please look on the blood of Yeshua and not on me, Father. Don't look on me. Don't judge me. Cover me. Look at his blood instead, right? So you do that and you're clean. You wipe the slate clean. So if you die in your sleep or something, you're clean, right? You're clean. And then when you have the wicked thought the next day, all right, the battle resumes. The concept of this is hinted at in the letters by Rav Shaul when he talks about having the mind, the whole mind of Mashiach, right? The mind of the Messiah, right? Having the mind of Messiah, this is in Hebrew, it says like thinking within yourself, right? Within your heart. It's about changing our desires. And a lot of times wicked thoughts, you have to cut off the root. And so practically speaking, the root is something that you want or you think you want or your flesh wants, right? Or your eyes want. Maybe your eye is evil. Yeshua warns, if your eye is evil, your whole body is then contaminated, right? So if this is happening to you, you need to set some goals in your life, set some things that you'd like to achieve, and spell out and tell your neshama, tell your spirit what you really want. This is what I want. I want to live like this. I want to be a mensch. I want to be a good person. I want to walk in the ways. I don't want to be tormented by evil thoughts. And you make the list, write it down, and then review that in the mornings if this is who you want to become. This is your goal. Just having the goal in sight can sometimes help you to avoid having those negative desires, because it's really the desires that are influencing the thought life. Sometimes it's past sins. Sometimes a person has a past sin or a past behavior, right? Before they were in the Messiah and in the Torah, in the law, where they have to erase that behavior. They were living as a lawless Christian, for example, right? Just, eating whatever they want, right? Doing whatever they want on whatever day of the week, defiling the Sabbath day, defiling their body, hanging out in graveyards, whatever. Just doing all, paintings of saints on the wall, whatever kind of things that are against the Bible. And so many people who have come from that kind of Gentile background, and by the way, I'm not picking just on those born Gentiles. We all have stuff from our youth that we've done that is foolish, right? And bad habits and that kind of stuff. So if the memories are what are tormenting you, if that's what the source is, then there is a great tool that I learned from Anthony Robbins in his human needs psychology teachings. I can't remember what the course was called, but it's about human needs psychology. And Anthony Robbins, he says that if you have a thought that keeps coming back and torturing you, then what you need to do is you need to, like a record, the old record, the vinyl players? If a record was scratched, the music couldn't play, right? It would play la 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 da da, and then go back la la, right? It could like keep repeating, right? What you need to do is scratch the whole memory up, okay? So what you do is you close your eyes and you allow yourself to experience one of the negative thoughts the brother's asking about, okay? Whatever your issue is, okay? Let one come in, okay? Just let it come in, don't resist it. And now when it's there, imagine something ridiculous, like Mickey Mouse is dancing all over the place, right? Or Donald Duck is vomiting, or whatever you like. So cartoons are great because that immediately signals childish to us. Like when we're young, we act like children. When we're older, we should behave more like adults. And so you keep doing this. Imagine in detail and let it be funny. Let it be ridiculous. Introduce a clown running around in the memory. He's part of your memory now, right? Go back, allow the memory to come again, and this time scratch it some more. Do some more visualizations of. It doesn't all have to be funny. Maybe you're like flying over a canyon. For some people, scenic memories work better for riding over those bad ones. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're destroying that old memory, and you do this. You might need to spend like 20 minutes overriding it, right? And you keep allowing it to resurface, and then scratch it up with other memories, right? Like, I don't know, a UFO flying around, whatever goofy stuff works for you. You have to get creative, and you do this over and over and over for about 20 minutes. And guess what? The next time this memory tries to torture you, you're going to remember one of those goofy parts, and it will make it easier to dismiss. Because your mind is processing, is this important? And usually the processing, the way the mind works for memories is that emotions are remembered more often than data, right? Or they tag to the data, right? So if there's an emotion involved, like, oh, I'm a terrible person, or whatever, maybe it's, lust, or maybe it's, gore, or whatever like that, your brain thinks that's important. And so it will keep torturing you with it because it thinks it's important. Hey, we got to remember so that you don't do this again. We don't want you to get a leg chopped off, right? And so what you need to do is you're hacking yourself. When you overwrite the memory and you go through this technique of rewrite, so that now there's some humor, right? Do you remember every single joke you've ever been told? No, because humor is not as powerful as dread, right? Humor is not as powerful as fear. Humor is not as powerful as lust. Humor is not as powerful as gore or pain or any of these other things. So when you override it with humor and ridiculous childish things, you'll forget. That's why you forget a lot of things from your childhood. Usually the things that people remember from their childhood from a very young age are tragic events. Like 3 and younger is something bad happened to you that you remember for this very reason. Okay, so I hope that helps you, brother. And you can always chat with me online privately about it if you like on Telegram, okay? And I'd be happy to counsel you with some of this stuff. It's a good question, though. All right, let me see if there's any other comments. Yeah, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Okay, there's some other comments. Let's see. Tet chimes in that in the letter to the Kahal at Rome, known as Romans, chapter 12, verse 2, the Greek word for mind, nois, nice, a masculine noun, is defined as the God-given capacity of each person to think or to reason. Thank you for that, Tet. Very good. Yep. It's also related to dianoso, which is the word which translates from levav in Hebrew, heart. So whenever the Hebrew Bible talks about in his heart, it means in his mind. That's where the mind is really the battlefield. So I'm appreciative that the brother asked that question. And Ted says that the mind is the organ where God deposits his thoughts. True, very true. Yeah, good. Okay. All right, let's continue. Good talk. All right.
Hey, you made it to the end of this part of the drash. Mazel tov. Watch the next one. Please remember to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you like the content. Donations may be sent to patreon.com/Hebrew literacy. And as always, Kol Kavod L'Adonai, all glory